OK, you join us live at Westminster, where you can see the demonstrators are out in force as they argue for whichever side of the argument they are on. It all gets focused in Parliament a little bit later, when potentially there will be that discussion about the opposition move to try to stop a no-deal Brexit. The Speaker is just considering the position that has been put forward to him, and he will make his decision later, but it's expected that that debate will happen in Parliament a little bit later with a vote sometime this evening. It's time for BBC Ask This. We've got your questions on Brexit today, and joining me is Bronwen Maddox, and also Director of the Institute for Government, and also our reality check correspondent, Chris Morris. So we've got a whole list of questions in for you both. Here we have, so let's crack on. Pete W asks, if Parliament takes over the timetable and Boris Johnson loses the vote to call an election, what happens next? Who wants that?
Well, there's ifs and ifs in there. But what Pete is talking about is if Parliament wins in what it's trying now, the Rebels, and so they take control of the business of the House of Commons, and they try and get through a piece of legislation forcing an extension, or forcing the government to ask for an extension. And then Boris Johnson counters that by saying, look, I want to call a general election, but he also doesn't get the two-thirds support that he would be required under the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act to get in order to have a general election. What happens then? Well, in theory, if this legislation that the rebels are trying gets through, the government will be forced to ask the EU for an extension unless Parliament has, by October 19th, agreed to a deal, or has, much more likely, agreed to no deal. So he could still say, right, I'm still trying to get a deal off the EU. You've made it much harder, but I'm trying to get a deal off the EU, and I'm going to bring that to Parliament.
But don't forget though that unless things change, we're also due to have a 5-week suspension of Parliament from next week. So MPs wouldn't be there for most of that time, unless of course the government changes course. But essentially it would mean that if this went through, then it would look like the rebel alliance they call them have won. They have the ability to instruct the Prime Minister to extend the Brexit process, and there wouldn't be an election until, under the terms of the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, 2/3 of MPs vote for it.
Except
there's always an
except. The reason that he would lose it, given that Labour has been very, very keen on general election, the reason would be Labour's suspicion that he might try and call it for after October 31st. And that's what Labour's indicating at the moment. So the way he would win that vote, calling for a general election, would be by promising absolutely cast iron that it would be before October 31st. They might say, we don't believe you, you might move the date. Now there's a whole other area of debate about whether or not he's got the powers to do that. Well, possibly, but that would get him into all kinds of constitutional, possibly legal problems, bringing in the Queen. Or he could, allow a piece of legislation to go through the Commons that would absolutely lock in an election before October 31st. And that's how, if he really, really wanted that general election, that's how he would be sure of getting those votes.
And he could potentially be a real minority government, having taken the whip away from any Tory MPs that vote against today. So that would obviously be a driver for wanting an election.
There's a set of questions under the Conservative Party's own rules, which are different from Labour's rules, about that it doesn't really recognise as Conservative Conservative MP who's had the whip in the Commons taken away, unless the local associations, who have an enormous amount of power under Conservative rules, unless they agree, as Philip Hammond was saying today, that his own association had agreed. So a whole other load of complexity there.
Claude Scott, what happens if the EU imposes conditions to an extension?
So the extension that the bill requests, a piece of legislation that the Rebel Alliance hope to start tomorrow, if the EU came back with something else, the bill suggests that MPs would have 2 days to reject it. If they didn't reject it, then the Prime Minister would have to accept it. So in other words, what the bill is trying to do is not give the EU carte blanche, but put the decision on whether to accept what the EU says in the hands of MPs rather than in the hands of the government.
Michael Davis, if we leave the EU without a deal on the 31st of October, what will happen in respect of the Irish border?
How long have you got?
This has emerged, and I think absolutely rightly, as the single greatest problem about no deal. In theory, the UK government position has been, look, we wouldn't rush to impose tariffs or anything, but the EU position is, look, we have to protect the integrity of the single market and customs union, so in theory that they would have to. But both sides have said that they don't want a hard border. Something would have to give, and possibly the Republic of Ireland would be forced into the position it absolutely doesn't want, of having to bring in checks itself. But what officials are most afraid of is just informal blocks of the border, possibly done by Northern Ireland farmers who would see on the first hours of November 1st goods from the south going north, but they wouldn't be able to sell their milk and other things south. Would they seek to block it? And that's what, when they talk about civil unrest, and the Yellow Hammer documents that came out a few weeks ago, this is one of the things they may be referring to. So an awful lot would have to happen, but it would have to get done.
So, and worth emphasising that, a big problem for the UK, but a massive problem for the Republic of Ireland as well.
Mandy Peden, what would our status be in trade negotiations with the EU after a no-deal Brexit?
We would be trying to do a trade deal with our former trading union. They would be really fed up with us, and but we would still have to try and strike some kind of trading deal. It just would take some time.
At a time when the EU has said, if you leave with no deal, the first things we want to talk about will be familiar to anyone who's ever read Good Luck If You Have the Withdrawal Agreement. They first want to talk about the Irish border, citizens' rights, and the divorce bill, the financial settlement. So they've said until we've sorted those issues out, those withdrawal agreement issues, we wouldn't even go on to talk about a future trade agreement anyway. Let's see.
Thank you both very much. Thank you for your questions at home.